not being in touch with our vision, which is equally important. Our churches write a lot about vision, by the way. That's one of the plagues of the age, in my opinion. Because I think it's already written for us. What we have to do is pursue it. It's already here in the book, you see. And we ignore that and we come up with fancy words and pretty slogans. God does a better job than that, in my opinion. But a vision is really an outgrowth of one's worldview. Worldview is a word that came into our language more than a century ago from the good old German to a great wordsmith. In German, it's Weltanschauung. Not that you care. But it has a slightly different nuance. When we say worldview, we're pretty kind of basic. How do you look at the world? Well, Weltanschauung already points us to the fact that it's a little more than that. It's how you interpret the world, how you evaluate, how you understand. And those things can be very, very different from culture to culture, person to person. A simple geographic illustration of how viewpoints can vary is, imagine looking at the village from the valley. You'll see every tree, you'll see the houses, you'll see the cobblestones that need to be replaced, whatever's going on, you'll see it in its basic, upfront, impersonal way. But what if you were to go to the nearby mountain and look down? You might see several villages. You might see a river on one side. You wouldn't see the village in detail. You'd see it as part of the whole system of villages and the area of the world in which you find yourself. It's a different worldview. And where you stand and how you evaluate is important. And it's one of the things we kind of alluded to this morning that makes listening important. Because sometimes people say things that may offend you or may amaze you or, may confuse you until you get to know them and understand how they're looking at the situation. Suddenly you realize that's why they said that. That's where they're coming from. That's a better way of putting it in a sense. And so, as we look at this psalm today, the Psalm of David, in the order of the Psalms, which is not a chronological or any other kind of order, this is the first one you come to where David is beginning to get a little negative about his life. It's a psalm in which he's praying to God for relief from his enemies. Which tells me, by the way, there are ways to do that. But I think in the age of grace, it takes a different form. I really do. David was not wrong to pray the way he did. Or God would have told him so. And told us so. David prays this way because he's on the backside of Calvary. What God is going to do, he's told the world, is to send someone to undo the mess of Adam and Eve. But he hasn't, for the average man or woman, hasn't really laid out in detail what that is. With our dear little girl, you can say she's going to have an operation and move on, and some people will have all the information they need. But it's a whole different thing to know what they're going to cut, how they're going to do it, what they're going to, that whole thing is a whole different perspective, right? And so at Calvary, we meet God's plan in detail. That he sent his son. All of which was alluded to in the Old Testament. Don't misunderstand me. It's not invisible in the Old Testament. It's just not as on the surface. He sent his son. He sent his son to be a sacrifice for our sin, that he could bear the punishment for our sin, so that we could be forgiven, that we could go free, that we could have new life in him, eternal life, as a matter of fact. And Jesus makes it quite clear, a better life, abundant life, and the hope of an eternity with him in a very, very special place that is being designed and made just for us. No one ever designed and made a house just for me. I'm looking forward to that. But more than that, I'm looking forward to seeing Christ my Savior. And so we have all of that at work, and it's poetry. Some of the reason that David is extreme at times is because that's poetry. Poetry becomes prose when you make it dull and flat. That's the nature of poetry, is saying things in ways that are not everyday. Until the modern age when poetry has become anything I care to say, and put poetic lines. But that's just my bias. We'll move on. So in conclusion of his prayer, he calls upon God to get up and do something. Have you ever done that? I'll bet you haven't. He says, arise, O Lord. Get up and do something. Confront him. Subdue him. Deliver my soul from the wicked by your sword, from men by your hand, O Lord. That's pretty dramatic, isn't it? That's pretty dramatic. But the part I want to focus on actually begins just after that and goes to the end. I think we'll be somewhat brief today, but I think it's important. I had a pastor once who told the congregation, if the topic requires 2 hours, I'm going to speak for 2 hours. If it requires 15 minutes, I'm going to speak for 15 minutes. And he lived out his promise. Very unique in the world. Most of us function by the clock. If we fall short, we feel like we've not earned our keep, and if we run over, we feel like people may not want to come back. So let's be free of that. We're here for now and for God, okay? But he says, after calling God to get up and do something, in verse 14, he defines the man that he wants him to act against, or the men, as men of this world whose portion is in this life. And he says, you fill their womb with treasure. That's clearly poetry. Men don't have wombs, right? Understand what a poet does. But it means that in every way they are filled up from the inside out with good things of this life. They are satisfied with children. They don't lack for children. Very important in the ancient world, and still very important in many of us today. My life would not be nearly as rich if I didn't have the 2 children that I do, and if I didn't, God would supply my need in other ways. In fact, I met Carolyn when I said to God, I'm going to stop complaining about not being married and not having children, and I'm going to enjoy the children you gave me, because I sat down and counted all my Sunday school teachers, my campers, and other various things that the Lord had allowed me to minister to and be involved in their life. And at age 28, it already amounted to nearly 150 children. How could I not be satisfied with that? And you know, some of them are Facebook friends and such to me today. So God is good. And when I released it, then I met my wife. And we were able to have the family that we wanted to have. So they have the children, and they leave their abundance to their infants. Now, in the spirit of what we did downstairs, here's the question. So what's wrong with that? Is it wrong for them to have stuff? Is it wrong for them to have lots of children? Is it wrong for them to live such that the children's children will have an inheritance to help them through this life? Is that a problem? And here's the even bigger problem. God says it's not. God tells us in the first 3 chapters of Genesis that he made man and gave him dominion over this world, that he could rule it and tend it and make it produce. And then he said to the couple, be fruitful, multiply. And I am amongst those who do not find any basis in the scripture for saying that which is called a creation mandate, that he ever removed that. You know, and I also see that any attempt to limit the population historically in our world has resulted in genocide, usually directed at people we don't like. And footnote, and I'm going to be bald about this, but that's where Planned Parenthood comes from. It came from a group of white women who were bothered by the fact that there were too many blacks and too many Hispanics in their world. So you should know that, because if you read their own publications, they're more sophisticated now, but it has not changed. And that should be abhorrent to all of us in this room. Are we agreed? That is appalling. And we live in that world that does seem to be opposed to this. But God said, no, do that. Do that. If God told us to be fruitful and multiply, and it was time to stop, he's the one who could have stopped it. He could have closed every womb on the planet if he wanted to. He did that in the scriptures. Certain ladies were kept from having children. He doesn't need us to do that. And it would be fair and right and just if he did it, let me tell you. He's made us a world that he intended would supply the needs of the population he put here. We don't have to worry about that. So we go back to this and we say, what's up? And then you go over to let's do that. Timothy, 1 Timothy. Because there's the matter of money and providing for the kids, so let's address that. Is that something that they should not, that an evil person should be associated with? Somewhere I have down there. Give me a minute. That way we won't spend our time searching for a verse that I know is there. And I wrote down on a piece of paper where it was. 1 Timothy 5. I usually write the notes and get them out of my system, but every once in a while the numbers are involved. Verse 13. No, that's not right. It's in here somewhere.
What chapter?
Chapter 5 of 1 Timothy. Gee, I did work to look this up too. Let me try 2 Timothy. You know that sometimes like that. No, there's no 5 this chapter 2. That's a problem. Okay. I promise to get back to you with the exact verse. But in the verse where, because Timothy is being trained to be a pastor, and this will come up in the life of any pastor, he's told, look, if the guy won't work, you don't feed him. It's not if the guy can't work, that's a different thing altogether. But if the guy won't work, let him go hungry. And that's a paraphrase, by the way. I mean, it's my words, not the exact words of Scripture. That's why I like to quote from Scripture. And then he goes on to say that person is worse than an unbeliever. They shouldn't even be considered a Christian if they're not motivated to care for their family. That's just wrong in God's eyes. Not in Ralph's eyes, in God's eyes. It's just wrong. She's going to find it. She's going to work till she finds it.
Me?
Yeah. Unbeliever. Look up the word unbeliever. That's what I learned. The old version said infidel. What is it?
I think it's 8.
8.
We just
You did this after I turned back, right? Let's see. These folks will tell you, I don't do this. This is unique. This is to humble Ralph. This is what this is.
Yeah.
You got it? You want to read it?
1 Timothy 5:8.
Yeah.
But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever.
That's pretty blatant, isn't it? Read it again out loud. Good.
But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. It's 1 Timothy 5:8.
Yeah, okay. So what's going on here? This evil man is being accused of being wealthy, having a good-sized family, and caring for their future. What is wrong with that? Well, read carefully the phrase that led into it. For men of the world whose portion is in this life. here's the problem. That's all that man has. He has no concern about the future after his death. He has no worldview that includes God in it. He does what he does, and he's completely unaware that these greater issues exist. And yet God seems to bless him. And David is saying, these kinds of people, and he uses the word arrogant for them earlier, they're constantly coming against me, and yet they don't even acknowledge you. They don't even acknowledge you. That's the problem. They're doing what they're doing, all of it, in a sense, good stuff, in total disregard of God in heaven, to whom we all must answer. That may not seem like a big problem to you, but David has discovered that it is. And God would say that it is. Because if you rule God out of your life, you have no new life in him. You have no future. And he wants you to have those things. He wants you to know his love. But if your love is completely directed at this world and this world's things, and takes no note of him, you won't find him. The alternative and the vision of every believer is expressed in verse 15. As for me, I shall behold your face in righteousness. David's vision, his desired vision, is to see God. So much so, when I awake, I shall be satisfied with your likeness. We make a joke about it sometimes. I've heard pastors say, you know, there's the kind of person who wakes up and says, "Good morning, Lord." That's David here. And that was the one that says, "Good Lord, good morning." And it's funny, but it's not good. I love to be in those churches where half of the testimonies begin with, "I thank the Lord for waking me up and bringing me another day in a sound mind and in a healthy body," or some version thereof. Acknowledging that God is in the little things, in the basics of life, before we get to anything like he gave me a job or something like that. Which is, God does those things too, by the way. The focus of a Christian is on God. And from that vantage point, from God's point of view, we learn to see the world. We evaluate what is of worth, is worthy of my time, and what is not. We shape our goals. We make our plans in the light of his face, the knowledge of him. What will please God? What will bring me closer to God? What will bring others to God? What will bring them closer to God? The wicked man has reversed things so that he comes first. I told you I'd be short, because that's all I really want to say. Is as Christians, get back in touch with the vision of the Christian faith. And that is Jesus. In everything, see him. Look at him. Understand what his life here, his death here, his resurrection is saying to us and represents for us. And live accordingly. If God sent his only Son to die for us, what can we tell God not to call us to do? There's a verse in Romans that says, Romans 8, very familiar. He who did not spare his own Son, but gave him up for us, how shall he not with him give us all things? And some people interpret it to me because he gave us Jesus, he's going to give us things. Oh, no, no, no. He may. That's up to him. It may also mean he gives us, as Jesus called us to, a cross to bear. Right? If he was willing to sacrifice his son for the goodness of the human race, he's got to be free to do with me anything that will benefit this world, in the sense of bringing them to Christ. You understand? That's just one example of how a Christian worldview will change your attitude. So when something happens to me, and I've had this experience, I used to, you always get down. You wreck the car, you wonder how to replace it or whatever. Now when something happens, I kid you not, I immediately think, well, what is God going to do in this situation? I don't know what it is. I don't know what it'll look like. I can't even imagine it, but I know my God will do something with this, and it will be great. And it always is. It always is. I got to testify to the Fellowship of Faith one time when I wasn't in an accident. 2 guys in a truck. And it was one of those, it was a true accident, but we won't go there. And the driver got out and I got out. I apologized. He said he understood. He was driving a work truck, a little van. And the guy he was riding with he turned out to be a believer from Grace Church in Souderton. His rider, not at all. And when he saw that his friend was not riding up one side and down the other side, he got out of the truck and began to scream at me about how it was my fault and blah, blah, blah. And his friend said, "It's all right." "What do you mean it's all right?" "I got this. He's going to pay for it. I'm going to let him." And then he shook my hand and said, "Thank you, brother. Have a good day." This guy was beside himself. But for the first time, I bet in his life, he was seeing the reality of a faith that we have. We don't have to scream and yell at each other because we know that we're fallible people and we make mistakes. And so we make room for that. We forgive and we pay for our mistakes. Right? You talked about a certain song leader writer. Years ago, I heard this song. She was going to deal with this at one point with the ladies. And I never heard it again as a solo. But it stuck with me. I got the words off the internet. I found that it only changed 2 in my mind over 40 years. And I want to share that with you today because it has like 3 levels of emotion and centers on this whole issue. It goes like this. I traveled down a lonely road. No one seemed to care. The burden on my weary back had bowed me to despair. I oft complained to Jesus about how folks were treating me. And then I heard him say so tenderly, "My feet were also weary upon the Calvary road, and my cross became so heavy that I fell beneath the load. Be faithful, weary pilgrim. The morning I can see. Just lift your cross and follow close to me." I'd worked so hard for Jesus. I'd often boast and say, "Why, I've sacrificed a lot of things to walk the narrow way. I gave up fame and fortune. Lord, I'm worth a lot to thee." And then I heard him gently say to me, "I left my throne in glory. I counted it but loss, and these hands were nailed in anger upon a cruel cross. But now we'll walk together with your hand safe in mine. Just lift your cross and follow close to me. So if perchance I die upon a foreign field someday, would be no more than love demands, no less could I repay. What greater love hath mortal man than for a friend to die? These are the words he sweetly spoke to me. If just a cup of water I place within your hand, then just a cup of water is all that I demand. But if by death to living they can thy glory see, I'll lift my cross and follow close to thee. That's why I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back, no turning back. And that's your commitment. Stand with me.